All right, good afternoon. My name is Stan Benfell. I'm the Associate Director of the David M. Kennedy Center for International Studies here at Brigham Young University. And I'm happy to welcome you to this week's lecture in our semester-long series on the theme of race, myths, and realities. We're very fortunate today to be hearing from Vann Newkirk, a well-known writer and journalist. We're grateful he's taken some time to share some of his work with us today. The Kennedy Center sponsors a number of lectures and other events, and so I invite you to find out more about them by visiting our website, which is just kennedy.byu.edu, or by following us on Facebook or Instagram. Let me just draw attention to a couple of events. You may know that our Global Women's Studies program has a colloquium on many Thursdays, including tomorrow at noon, and they'll be inviting some artists to their discussion, Jan Howarth and Liberty Blake. There's also tomorrow at 1 o'clock, one in our series of what we call AMAs, which is Ask Me Anything, by people, usually our alumni that have gone on in various careers and are available to answer questions about what they've learned in the course of pursuing their careers, how their undergraduate studies prepared them, what advice they may have, and so on. So that's at 1 o'clock tomorrow with David Meekham. And I think Corey is going to, in the chat, he'll put some information about that. If you want more, you can click on the links that are there. But we will begin, as is our custom at BYU, with an opening prayer, which will be offered by Pamela Laurent, who is from Boston and who is the student assistant in our Africana Studies program. Following that invocation, Leslie Hadfield, Associate Professor of History here at BYU and the coordinator of our Africana Studies program, will introduce our speaker. So Pamela, if you unmute and offer the prayer, please.
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. We're extremely grateful to have Vann Newkirk speak to us today, and we pray that we could open our hearts and our minds to expand our knowledge on what he has to speak to us today. And we're extremely grateful, and we pray for those who aren't here that they can make it here safely. And we say this in the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
All right, thank you, Pam, for that prayer. And I'm really excited. We've been talking about getting Vann R. Newkirk II here at BYU for a while, and now it's happening, and so I'm really excited about that. We hope that someday we'll get him here in person. Newkirk is a vibrant and productive journalist with valuable insights into politics and policy in our country, especially regarding health, race, and voting. As evidence of this, you can see this. He was a 2020 11th Hour Fellow at New America, a 2020 James Beard Award finalist, and a recipient of the American Society of Magazine Editors ASME Next Award. He is a senior editor at The Atlantic, where he has covered the battles for voting rights since the 2013 Shelby County Supreme Court decision, the fate of communities on the front lines of climate change and disasters, and the Black vote in the 2018 and 2020 elections. He also wrote the September 2019 cover story for The Atlantic on Black land loss. He's the host of The Atlantic's podcast Floodlines, a narrative series about Hurricane Katrina, and his forthcoming book, Children of the Flood, chronicles Black America's fight against climate crises, which I think is really linked to that work he's been doing. And he's also the co-founder and contributing editor of Seven Scribes, a website and community that promotes young writers and artists of color. He holds degrees from Morehouse and UNC Chapel Hill, which was in public health and health policy. So you can see that connection with his journalism and public health. And I would also like to thank Kimberly Applewhite, who is a former BYU CAPS professor who went to school with Vann Newkirk in North Carolina and put us in touch with him in the first place. So I just wanted to give her a shout out. And I'm excited for all of you to hear Van Newkirk and his way with words and his insights into our country. So I will turn the time over to him. Oh, let me just quickly say, if you have questions, you can send them to me directly. I will be moderating the question and answer in the chat, again, directly to me when he's finished speaking. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Leslie, and thank you, Pamela, for the prayer, and thank you, Stan, for helping put everything together and for the introduction. I love the mention of Kimberly because it makes me sort of reflect on how old we're getting. We were high school buddies, and our 15th reunion is coming up this year. So yeah, that always reminds me. First of all, I want to thank everybody for coming, for inviting me to speak, to the Kennedy Center staff, to Brigham Young University, and everybody who decided to join this Zoom in the middle of the day. I'm grateful. I'm going to be honest. I absolutely hate Zoom. I hate looking at the little box or trying to look at the camera and trying to fix my face in the little box. I hate trying to keep my eyes in two different places instead of looking at people when I speak. I hate all the technical difficulties and the weird way that people's voices are kind of tinny on the internet. And I hope some of you all, as you have done Zoom instruction and countless Zoom meetings, I hope you all can feel me. But at the end, when I get to the Q&A and get to engage with everybody's thoughtful questions, especially on this topic that I'm about to discuss, which is near and dear to me, I'm excited, whatever form, whatever medium, and I find joy in the ability to do it. I usually try to start off these things with a joke, to ease things up, to make the Zoom stuff more bearable. But I do think it's most appropriate that I start off on a more serious note. I always like to know about what's going on where I speak. And in pre-pandemic days, that meant going to universities a day or so in advance, just so I could chat with students and make sure that what I'm saying actually has meaning to people's lives. These days, I've relied on newspapers and calling head with some students and organizations that I knew. And people did bring up the recent news about LGBTQ students lighting up the Y and the history of the code of conduct on the university prohibition on same-sex and queer romantic relationships. You'll have to forgive me for my lack of fluency in these matters. I'm married to a woman and not entirely versed in the matters of faith and doctrine that make your university such a unique place and campus. But as far as I understand, I was brought in, and this lecture series was created to challenge and expand our understanding of the world. And for me, I would be remiss not to mention that so much of what I have to say about democracy, about race, about expanding our worldview also comes from people who were queer and who had to fight for their right to be heard as well. From Lorraine Hansberry to James Baldwin to Audre Lorde and beyond, the struggle of queer folks' recognition in all spaces is intricately tied to the struggle for multiracial democracy, which is what I'm talking about. And I would be intellectually disingenuous if I did not mention that and say that I recognize the freedom struggle there. And for the queer folks who are listening, who may tune into this later, that I see you and you are recognized. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that we are speaking really just hours after several Asian and Asian American women were killed at work in Georgia amid a spike in hate crimes and violence against Asian American and Pacific Islander folks across the country. I know there are likely people who are on this Zoom who feel stunned and sick still, who have had to have long calls and talks with family and friends already, and who might themselves be feeling unsafe and uncertain right now. I think it's important that all of us stand in solidarity with the AAPI community and that we take every opportunity to try and dismantle white supremacy and racism to create a world of safety, care, and opportunity for everybody, as is true for queer folks, as is true for Black folks. The matter of democracy can only be settled when we have replaced the structures that have disenfranchised and scapegoated folks. And in my mind, in my theory, in my work and reporting, we're talking about one thing here. We're not talking about a bunch of different issues across a bunch of different fields. We're talking about freedom, and we're talking about democracy. and the ability to participate and be heard in this country. So I'm already a couple minutes in, and I've mentioned this word democracy a few times, which might seem paradoxical given the fact that I've titled this talk, The Myth of Democracy. I think you'll find that even I suffer from a bit of cognitive dissonance when it comes to separating the narrative, the origin story of America, from what I've researched and reported on for years. And I'm sure you all know that origin story pretty well, right? America was founded as a radical experiment in democracy, built on a constitution that enshrined a national form of government that has simply not been seen worldwide. We were a shining city on a hill. Our constitution drew from some ancient experiments in participatory government, like from the classical Athenians and the days of the Roman Senate, and created a governing structure that sought to resist tyranny, the concentration of power, and hereditary leadership. And at the foundation of the edifice that the founders created in our origin story, in its very bedrock, was the ability of regular people to vote and to determine who their leaders would be. But now, let us begin to peel back the layers of that particular onion for a moment. What really happened was, in the era immediately following the birth of the constitutional democracy, in most states, only white male property owners over the age of 21, a really small proportion of the country, could vote. And the things they could actually vote for were pretty limited. For example, state legislatures selected US senators for like 100 years. You couldn't even vote for your senator for half of our country's history. For about a third of the country's history, white male landowners decided just about everything. And in the era before the Civil War, the 3/5 compromise that gave additional representation to states where people who owned slaves actually gave the largest of those landowners, the plantation owners, even more power over laws. They could essentially, by buying humans, buy votes. That changed a little bit when white men who didn't own land were given the right to vote. But still, you could say that for a century of American history or more, not only was the right to vote denied to the vast majority of Americans, but more voting power was given to people on the basis of owning other people. Now, would you call that a true democracy? Now, of course, things changed. We do not live in the America of 1780 or 1840. We had a little thing called the Civil War. We all knew it was fought over slavery and the ability of planters to continue and grow their political power by way of owning people that we just talked about. Good thing for my folks, good thing for my great however many grandparents, with plenty of their own blood, sweat, and tears, the Confederacy lost that fight. And soon after, Congress passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Taken together, these amendments outlawed slavery, dismantled the political power of the 3/5 clause gave slave owners, and granted formerly enslaved people the right to vote. And for the space of about a decade, they were able to exercise that right to vote. During what we call Reconstruction, the period immediately following the Civil War, Black folks voted Black politicians into office for the first time, including our very first Black senators. They voted for local and state laws protecting their communities and kept the victors of the Civil War, the Union in the North, at power in a national level. But in 1876, the federal government stopped using the power of the military to guarantee that right to vote. We ended Reconstruction, and the former Confederate states started coming up with constitutions that created things like poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. And the grandfather clause is where you can't vote if your grandfather could vote. And that was, obviously a problem for people whose grandparents were, say, enslaved. That era started what we call Jim Crow era, which effectively took away the vote from all Black folks for almost 100 more years. So in 1876, we're back in the place where effectively only white men can vote. That's the status quo for almost 50 more years until the 19th Amendment in 1920, which gave women, but in reality just white women, the right to vote. Indigenous folks weren't considered voting citizens nationwide until 1924, and all states didn't grant them the ballot for another 40 years. Finally, in 1965, the Voting Rights Act, the VRA, effectively gave Black folks and some other people of color in the South the right to vote. In 1971, 18-year-olds gained the ability to vote. So that meant that a lot of people who were tuning in would have the ability to vote in 1971 with the 26th Amendment. In 1975, the protections of the VRA were extended to communities that spoke languages other than English, which meant for the first time that lots of Latino and Asian American communities that finally gained protection for their voting rights. So in reality, I think opposed to our origin story, we're really talking about somewhere around the late 1960s and early to mid 1970s as the first moment when you could reasonably expect adult citizens of any race in any state to even be able to register and vote in safety. Even then, there have been big question marks and asterisks around things like the disenfranchisement of people in jail and prison and those who have felonies on their records. What I'd like to do when I talk about this is to do a little bit of a thought experiment. We take a minute to think about all that, just a minute. If the whole of American history were condensed into one day, the time when all the people we see voting now could vote would only last from about 7 p.m. to midnight. In a piece that I recently wrote for The Atlantic, I tried my best to put everything into perspective through the lives of people that I know. My mother was born in Mississippi in 1964, the year before the VRA was passed. The people in her family, none of the adults she knew, anybody she knew, they did not vote until then. The people they knew didn't vote. And it had been that way in Mississippi for generations. My mother was 24 when she had me, which means that really I was only 2 decades away from a time when people like me just could not and did not vote in America. Lots of people that I grew up with in church, who babysat me and who taught me as a child, have been at some point in their lives barred from voting. So what does that mean to us? Of course, of the American laws and projects that are often considered to be our biggest ones, you think about stuff like Reconstruction, you think about the New Deal, the Great Society under Lyndon B. Johnson, and beyond, really only the Reagan-era tax cuts, the Trump-era tax cuts, the Affordable Care Act in 2010, and our recent COVID stimulus bills have come from an electorate that even resembles the audience of this particular Zoom call. So all the different laws that govern your life, that govern everything from our ability to express our free speech to antitrust law, they were formed by an exclusive set of people that does not represent the people who are able to participate today. The entire Constitution and all but one of its amendments were written, considered, and approved by people who simply did not reflect America. Is that democracy? Now, I'm grateful that you all could indulge my history session. I'm sorry, my dad is an historian of Black history, so I can't really help it. This is what I do. But I do hope that all that history has at least been a little useful in making everybody a little bit more skeptical about the stories, the origin stories we tell about ourselves and the country, about who we are and about where we might be going. America's origin story, as lots of us perceive it, is one of a unique global experiment in people power. Our brand across the world now is one of freedom. When we engage in global conflict, we have always sold that conflict as defending democracy, freedom at home, or in the service of creating democracy or freedom abroad. Our most famous monument is that giant green lady in New York, the Statue of Liberty. In polls, people have consistently described the American dream, quote unquote, as having something to do with freedom and, of course, democracy. Those are all central pillars of American exceptionalism. And our moral authority in international relations is built uniquely on freedom and democracy. But all that freedom and democracy, it turns out, just as I tried to outline, that a lot of it is smoke and mirrors. Worse than that, as we said about the 3/5 clause, it really turns out that the American political order has been built on the explicit anti-democratic subjugation of different groups. The country has always talked a big game. That's always been part of the package since Ben Franklin was flying kites and making almanacs. But if you start thinking about it from the perspective of Black folks, Latino folks, Native American folks, and Asian Americans, really some of that game falls apart. So if America isn't a democracy, what is it? Give me 1 second. Well, please, you have to bear with me for a little bit more history. as I take the long way in answering that question. First, I want to acknowledge the most common objection to any history of democracy in America, which is when people say that America is a republic, not a democracy. And it's true. The US was not founded as a place where just any old person could vote for any old thing. Roughly, the country was founded as a constitutional democratic republic, where the democratic refers to the fact that at least some level of government derives from the actual choices of some regular people who are not nobles or hereditary elites, warlords, religious leaders, or bureaucrats. That's what democracy originally meant in America. In the history of the West, at least, that arrangement was genuinely new in the late 1700s. Europe, as we know, was a quilt of overlapping hereditary noble families and governments. The idea that some regular old person, even like a rich landowner, could have some say in the offices that lead the country, that was radical at the time. So we do have to acknowledge that. But the form that government took, that the founders created, it was Republican. It put the actual power of decision-making into a relatively small group of people who were elected. The Senate was created as a check on directly elected representatives. And originally, like I said, its members weren't even elected directly by people. The Electoral College also responded just as much to land and the artificial boundaries of states as to the actual wishes of citizens. So actually, I think the people who do the republic not a democracy thing, they're right, at least in terms of the intent of the founders. I might actually go a little bit further than that. I think it's safe to say that the founders were actively afraid of democracy in many cases. They feared that the power of the mob and actively sought to balance the political power of the rabble with strong executive offices, regardless of whether they or themselves held slaves or if they bent more towards abolition. They obviously, as a whole, did not want Black folks to be citizens. They didn't want women to be citizens. They did not think indigenous folks even belonged in the country and thought that even poor white men were to be, they were suspicious. They were not unworthy. They were not worthy of full citizenship. And even the well-respected white landowners that did get to vote for some things, they were treated with some suspicion too. The interpretation of laws, the final passage of laws, constitutional amendments, the ratification of treaties, and the impeachment of the president. Those are all things that we know now over the past 4 years or so. We know those to be really, they're really important. But those were all things that were actually not in the hands of directly elected representatives in government for most of the country's history. But I think we should go even further than that. Sure, America was a republic and not anything close to a direct democracy. But I think the record actually shows that the most enduring truth of the American idea has been the use of those republican tools for the dominion of the few over the many, for whites over non-whites, for those who mastered the land over those who were bound to toil on it. The dominant view of the founders in a generation that came after them was not just skeptical of democracy, rather it viewed multiracial participation as a degradation and viewed the subjugation of some people as a necessary piece of governance. And we see this dominant view throughout history. The dominant view was expressed in the fact that the presidency was founded by a dynasty of Virginians who owned slaves. It was expressed in the fact that the exclusion of Chinese and other undesirable immigrants was law in America for generations. The dominant view of America as a white man's utopia, it was expressed in the founding of the state of Oregon, where early laws sought to ban people of color from entry altogether. This dominant view formed the underpinnings of Jim Crow, the basis of court rulings that decided that brown Puerto Ricans and Filipinos were not quite civilized enough to be allowed into the country as citizens. Those decisions and the racism embedded in them is actually the reason why Puerto Rico and Guam are not states, and why people living in the American territories still retain something of second-class citizenship, and why they are unable to vote for the president. The dominant view of white hegemony in all realms of civil and legal rights has been an impediment, not something that's just laid to the side, not something that's just sort of gone away over time. It's been an active impediment to a free and a just society at every level for every single year of American history. Just as a side note, I mentioned the Electoral College earlier. That view, the active strain of white hegemony in America, it's the reason why we still have the Electoral College. It was originally favored by white Southern planters as a way to preserve their political power, since the number of electors the state received was based on your representation in Congress. And since all the enslaved people counted as 3/5 of a person for representation in Congress, it basically meant that the more slaves you owned, the more slaves were in a state, the more presidential electors a state had. And it was the way things were, us having the Electoral College until about 1970. It was the way things are now, but there was a serious challenge in 1970 when a movement to abolish the Electoral College almost succeeded. That was 5 years after the VRA and after the end of the Civil Rights era. It's hard to believe now, but we had a moment where it looked like we might actually get rid of the Electoral College. But just in the nick of time, white Southern planters viewed the ability of the Electoral College to minimize the power of individual votes as their last saving grace to stop all the losses they had suffered from the Voting Rights Act. I like to quote an Alabama senator who said that, quote, "The Electoral College is one of the South's few remaining political safeguards." So the reason why we have the Electoral College, first was from slave owners, and second was because people invested in Jim Crow voted to keep it around. If you think about that, think about the fact that it is the basic machinery of our most important elections that we hold every 4 years, then I think you should be a little even more skeptical of America and our origin stories. Now, I know I said I would cool it on the history lesson and all the weird digressions that I like to make, and I promise that I will. But I do hope that I've been able to show that we need to read between the lines a bit when it comes to America and our quote unquote democracy. The most historically honest assessment, I believe, of just what America actually is, isn't what we've been taught in school. America was neither a super radical shining city on a hill of democracy, nor a skeptical republic that progressed rationally over time to a higher ideal. The country was intended to be, and still retains the remnants of, an experiment in domination, whose participatory mechanisms will always cover for tyranny hiding in plain sight. Now, that may seem harsh, and it might be harsh, but I think it also helps us to reframe the next part of what I want to talk about. All those advances in democracy, all those extensions of the right to vote, they weren't inevitable stops on the road to progress. They were never freely given. They were seized by people trying to find their own way. And the push and pull between the rights of the many and the original intent of American dominion, that's what defines our current political era today. Now, just where are we today? I don't think that even the most pessimistic observer could look at the country and say that things haven't become genuinely more participatory over the course of history, that things haven't changed. I mean, just look at the government. The first Black president is old news now. I was in college when we elected Barack Obama. I have siblings who barely remember his election. It's old news. The vice president today is a woman of mixed Black and Indian ancestry. The very first time in American history when there were 2 Black senators at the same time, that was in 2013. And now there are 3 at the same time. And they work alongside 6 Latino senators and 2 Asian American senators, not to mention a growing contingent of representatives and cabinet officials from minority communities. Now, none of those bodies comes close to matching the actual demographics of the country, mind you, but even this level of participation would have been simply unfathomable to anybody walking around in like 1850. Now, representation is, of course, a shallow way of measuring progress, but there are other ways to look at things and see just how America has changed over time. I just look at the results of the last election. The election of Joe Biden to the presidency turned pretty strongly on votes from people of color and from women. And when Democrats swept Georgia's 2 Senate seats in historic runoff, it was on the strength of Black, Asian American, and Pacific Islander voters who would not have been able to vote in that state 55 years ago. Going back to President Obama's election, Black turnout has approached and even surpassed white turnout, and Latino voters have become more and more of a critical factor in swing states. In the half century since the VRA, voting has certainly become safer, more rational, and more accessible for people of color. Courts and lawmakers have expanded on the VRA with laws that did stuff like allowing people to register at to vote at their DMV, and expanding access to ballots in languages other than English. The DOJ and voting rights organizations have successfully challenged restrictive laws and gerrymandering in courts, and it is a default presumption, legally and legislatively, that it is the role of the federal government to step in when minority votes are being trampled on. That single presumption or principle, regardless of how it is enforced or interpreted, makes this era in American history one that's wholly different from any other time in the country's history. So I think I would say that we are living in the first real experiment of something resembling true multiracial democracy in America's history. That's a good thing. That's something you should cheer for. If you think about the example of my mom, who passed away this November at the age of 56, it's clear that this experiment, which is a good experiment, has not really lasted all that long. Just, the space of 2 generations, really. There are people who are still working at this university who were adults when this experiment started. But despite the relative newness of it all, I do think, it's something to be marveled at. We are living in a truly remarkable time in history, unlike any other. It's different from what the founders would have dared to dream, and probably pretty different from what they actually wanted. For most of America's history, lordship over disenfranchised populations was the point of voting in the first place. Now, those people who were lorded over, who worked in the fields, who toiled on the railroads, they get to participate in government. And it's all because of continued pressure and activism from and on behalf of those communities over the span of generations. But with that acknowledgement that we are living in an experiment comes acknowledgement that this era, this time, is extraordinarily fragile and fights against really some mighty powers that prefer the old ways. It fights against the inertia of American history. I think it's key to understand that all of the voter protections that we rely on, they're not really based on immovable hard barriers, say like gun rights or free speech rights given to us in the First and Second Amendments. The constitutional amendments addressing the right to vote spell out that it can't be taken away on account of race or gender, but they actually really leave things pretty open-ended on the matter of what can be used to take people's vote away and how to enforce it. And though that open-ended nature of the Constitution on voting, that's what let the door open for states to do stuff like Jim Crow laws and to do things like find ever more clever ways to restrict the right to vote, as long as they don't explicitly mention race or gender while doing it. What really protects this fragile order of this experiment now is legislation, stuff like the Voting Rights Act, stuff like HAVA in the 90s. And what we know about legislation, what we've learned over the past couple of years especially, is that legislation can be repealed, it can be reinterpreted, and it always relies on active enforcement and oversight by the executive branch. Ever since the Voting Rights Act was passed, a concerted movement against federal protection of minority voting rights, it has steered our political discourse and possibilities and sought to upend that fragile order. White Southern voters were originally rallied in 1966 and 1967 to vote in fear of Black political rule. And actually, to this day, one of the main predictors of whether white Southerners will oppose a given candidate is if Black folks support a candidate. A conservative legal movement that has pushed back year after year against the provisions of the VRA, and states have continued time and again to test the boundaries of federal oversight and protection. And frankly, I think they have the momentum now. In 2013, the Supreme Court effectively ended one of the most effective provisions of the VRA in the Shelby County versus Holder decision, which put a stop to proactive oversight of voting laws in places that have been known to discriminate. Since then, without that oversight, voter ID laws and other laws that have restricted the right to vote, they have proliferated across several states. And these laws have been proven time and again to disproportionately keep people of color away from the polls. And since 2013, the federal courts have become steadily more receptive to arguments in favor of restricting the right to vote. President Trump, for example, he ran on claims that millions of people of color were fraudulently voting. And he added justices to the Supreme Court and judges to lower courts that seemed to agree with that skepticism of democracy. Now, of course, we all know what happened with that skepticism of democracy in the last election. Trump and his folks made continued claims that the election was fraudulent. And their main problem, the thing that kept popping up in the lawsuits, was the fact that places with lots of minority voters had high turnout. Without a single shred of evidence, the sustained campaign of implying that minority votes were somehow fraudulent ended up sparking an insurrection in the Capitol on January 6th. And even after most of those people participating in the insurrection and challenging the election results on the floor of the Senate, after they've been disavowed by just about everybody, the disputes over the election have fueled movements in several states to make it harder to vote and to push back against the VRA. In just the past few weeks, I've been reporting on this. Politicians in Montana, Iowa, Georgia, Arizona, and Texas have moved forward with bills that would get rid of ballot drop boxes, strengthen voter ID requirements, and restrict early voting. And now, after 8 years, after Shelby County versus Holder, the courts are primed not only to allow those measures to go into place, but they might even challenge the actual structure, fabric, and legitimacy of the remainder of the VRA itself. I think we're in unprecedented territory right now. I really believe that we stand on a knife's edge when it comes to this brief, fragile, somewhat democratic experiment in America. At no point since the very beginning of its 55-year history has the Voting Rights Act been so imperiled. And now fears about illegitimate voting by minorities, they move closer and closer to the center of American politics. It's not to say that there's something new or unprecedented happening with regards to racism. It's been around forever. Rather, I hope that the takeaway from this speech is that the status quo of political domination, the same thing that was at play when the founders created the Constitution, when slave owners captured the presidency for generations, those things are still around. They are still ready to return. Now, this is probably the part of the speech at the end where somebody who was smarter than me would leave you with solutions. And I want to ask you to put your questions in the chat for me, please. Load them up for me so I can answer them, get to as many as possible. Now, there are plenty of solutions that are being considered to expand democracy and to fight against the rollback of voting rights in America. There's the For the People Act, which would mandate automatic registration, outlaw the disenfranchisement of people with felony records, and would expand ballot access and early voting nationally. There's the John Lewis Act, named after the deceased congressman and civil rights hero. That act would create a new proactive oversight structure for the VRA. There are reforms in states and at a national level to end gerrymandering, and ideas floating around to pack the courts with judges who are more in favor of expanding the right to vote. But more and more, the history tells me that we have to go deeper than those solutions. Individual fixes, they have immense value, but we need to think more about the underlying structure of what it means to be America. What is the idea of America? How is it enshrined in the Constitution? Is the real democracy that most people favor today, is it even compatible with America's source documentation and our founding ethos? Can we reconcile all these ideas and the continuous legal tradition with our parents and grandparents? Or is it in the interest of democracy to try to start something new altogether? I am not the smarter person who might give you all the answers to those questions. And maybe somebody on this call is. But one thing I do know is that we cannot see and shape the future if our understanding of the past is based on half-truth. And that's why I believe it is incumbent upon us all to tackle, to dismantle, to get rid of the myth of democracy and replace it with an understanding of just what America is and what it has meant to our people of color in the country. That's a place of great peril, but it's one that if we continue to follow their demands, also one of great promise. Again, thank you for having me for this speech, and I will answer any questions that you have in the chat.
Great, thank you so much. Van, for that provocative talk and provoking us to think about these things more deeply. We really appreciate it. There are a few questions that have come in already, and so I'm going to go ahead. There are a few people wanted me to read, and a lot of them have to do with some of these solutions and ways forward, but there are also people on here who are interested in history too. So I'm going to start with a history question, but is related to, I think, moving forward. And that is looking at the Reconstruction period. This is from Matt Mason in the history department, professor there, wondering how do we understand that period where there were some gains made after the Civil War, but then they were turned back. But is there something from that period that we maybe can learn in our particular time?
Oh, certainly. One of the most fascinating things about Reconstruction for me was that we like to think about it as an era where, you know, Black people gained the right to vote. And that is certainly the development, and we got rid of slavery. Those are the developments that are most important to me. But also, it was a period in which lots of poor white folks gained the ability to vote who had not voted before. It was a period in which there were things called fusion governments, where Black farmers and white farmers voted together in opposition to big interests of big plantations and industry. And so we like to think about sort of our divisions, our political divides today as being eternal, as being things that have been baked into the bread, you know, forever. But actually, I think Reconstruction tells us that there are several more radical and more egalitarian and more imaginative ways that race relations, especially, to play out in America and have played out in America. So yeah, I mean, and also it's been the tradition of lots of scholars now to refer to the Civil Rights era as a second Reconstruction. And lots of people viewed, say, the George Floyd protest last year, say the Black Lives Matter era, as a potential third Reconstruction. So the language of Reconstruction has been really useful for expanding our imagination on what's possible in America.
Okay, great, thank you. The next question has to do with this, the status quo of domination, right? How do we change, if you've got people in power, the lawmakers, and they're the ones that are creating this voter suppression, how can voters challenge that voter suppression? I hope that makes sense. Let me ask it just a slightly different way, because it came in two different kinds of questions. So this is another one. How do you get the people in power who hold unearned privilege and inordinate power, and who we might naturally presume want to hold on to all of the power they have, to surrender that privilege in the search for true democracy in America?
That is the eternal question. And it's one that I think a lot of these pieces of legislation, lots of voting rights advocates, they grapple with every day, right? Especially just based on the mechanical fact that voting rights laws are hoping to make it harder for people to go out and actually challenge those politicians, right? So how do you have a fair fight when one of the laws you're fighting against is holding your hand behind your back, kind of, right? I think there's a couple ways to think about it, though, to think about levers and institutions that have not traditionally been used that could prove useful. So one is, you know, participation in local elections, I think. Participation in our municipal governance. Lots of the things that become the statewide and national understandings of voting rights originate in local experiments. For example, my old community of Hyattsville, Maryland, they created an ordinance to allow undocumented immigrants to vote. And it was this pilot project that is unique in Maryland, but I think could be part of a conversation later on whether we allow immigrants to vote. And if you are actually taking if you're voting in those elections, if you're going to your city and town hall and county commissioner meetings and voicing your say there, I do think actually that's probably the place where our votes and our voices travel the most. So that's one lever. But also there are the thing that seems to be balancing things the most in politics against people who want to restrict the right to vote is the staggering effectiveness of small dollar money and donations and grassroots activism in politics today. So if you look at 2020, the election we just had, you had in some places, obviously you had a pandemic across the country. It made it really difficult for lots of people to vote. Even if states expanded early voting and mail-in voting, it was still very difficult for, say, elderly people in nursing homes to go vote, right? What actually gave us way higher turnout than expected was the effectiveness of groups that had raised money on the backs of $1 and $3 and $5 donations, and voting rights advocates who were going door to door in these places, who were wearing masks, who are finding ways around all of these barriers. And that level of energy, while I don't know if it's sustainable year to year in every single election, it is something that is not governed by those voting rights laws and restrictions, and seems to be actually really good at getting people fired up and giving them the activation energy to get over those hurdles to the ballot.
Thank you. Okay, so we have some similar questions. Daisy DeGamas had a question. Daisy, would you like to ask that? If you'll unmute yourself.
Yeah. First, thank you so much, Vann, for coming. Seriously, we are so much, we are so blessed to have you in our midst, because we need voices like yours. So my question changed a little bit. There's a verse by J. Cole in one of his songs that I think about really often, and it sparked again while you were talking. I just want to read it. It's one of his songs is Brackets. It starts off by saying, "Some older man told me to start voting. I said democracy is too effing slow. If I'm giving y'all this hard-earned bread, I want to know. Better yet, let me decide. It's 2018. Let me pick the things I'm funding from, an app on my screen, better than letting whack congressmen I've never seen dictate where my money goes, straight into the palms of some money-hungry company that makes guns, that circulate the country and then wind up in my hood making bloody clothes." I guess, we've been talking about democracy, but do you find any benefit, or I guess, do you see a benefit of still having representatives when we have amazing technology that, can maybe facilitate, can actually fit a better definition of democracy?
Well, number one, thank you for the J. Cole quote. I'm a Carolinian, so I've been listening to J. Cole since way back in the mixtape days. So I appreciate that. And my family, my grandfather's actually from Fayetteville, where J. Cole is from. So I know the song well, and more broadly, I know the sentiment well. It's we do have lots of ways to express ourselves today that aren't voting, and I think they are also part of democracy, where we spend our money, who we choose to associate with, just using our voice, actually saying what we don't like and don't like in social media, in hard media, the books we buy and how we educate ourselves, and the ways we talk to our friends, what we encourage our friends to do or not to do. Those are all parts of what we, self-determination and democracy. So I think he has a point there. And there are lots of functions that lots of people used to assign to representatives, say, giving them a voice. If you were from rural North Carolina, for example, there were very few ways for the president to know what was on your mind other than voting somebody in the House to speak for you, right? But actually, and that's changed today, right? You know, now you can just hop on Twitter or TikTok and say what you want to say, and people are going to see it, and it's going to become part of a thing. But also, on the other hand, you know, I think there are still many powerful things that go on at the level of official government that, at the very least, even if you're not interested in voting for things, even if you are not enthused about it, you should not ignore, because if you ignore them, it just gives people more cover to do awful things still in your name, because it's still technically a democracy, right? So if you aren't paying attention, if you aren't exerting your power at every possible opportunity, it's giving people the power to go out and wage war and bomb folks in your name. It's giving people the power to further corruption in government in your name. It's giving people the power to ignore climate change or to do whatever they want to do that you agree or disagree with in your name. And so I think it's, you know, if we are really keen on maximizing our power, it's important for us to at least make sure we know what's going on so that nobody does anything in our name that we don't know.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daisy, for that question. Okay, so this is another question that came in, and we have a couple more after this. So we'll see if people will stick around for a few more minutes. We still have some time before 1 o'clock, but this question is sort of related, maybe, so there could be some things you want to add on to what you just said from this question from Andrew Rees. Sorry, he asked me to read it for him. He said, other than greater representation, what changes in the American political system do you predict from the rising political participation of Black, AAPI, and other racial minority groups?
One thing that I think really depends on that participation is something I just mentioned, which is our fight against climate change, our fight to make a just and safe environment for all, not just all Americans, but all people on the globe. If we look at who is being affected most by some of the early effects of a changing climate, by sea level rise, by pollution from factories and landfills, it tends to be people of color. And it tends to be poor folks. And for me, if they are getting rid of those structures that place them in a line of fire is actually the first thing we have to do in order to fight climate change and pollution. And they have to be able to participate in order to do that. But beyond that, you know, I think the actual biggest change that participation from everybody can do is make more and more political participation normalized, is to expand it even further. So if more Black people, more Latino people, more Asian American folks, more poor folks, more women are voting today, and they are voting for laws that are going to expand to more of them, it essentially creates a positive feedback loop that will, in my reckoning, open up democracy for good and get rid of this trial period that I talked about, and hopefully usher in a real robust democracy in America that we won't really have to worry about disappearing for our children.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. I really appreciate that, adding those aspects in, the environmental aspect, right? That really is a big part of today. And it just reminds me of Wangar Maathai, great African activist who said we have to consider these things all together. So that's one thing I really appreciate about your work. Okay, so we have a couple of other questions about more specifics on proposals that restrict voter participation or could restrict voter participation, and then HR 1. So I think I'll ask this question first from Samuel Carlson. He says it's a basic question, but I think it's good for us to get into it if you don't mind talking about the voter ID laws. So he's grappling with this, people, I'll just read this. It says, people I have talked to defend voter ID laws as simply making sense in terms of voter security. The argument is that if voting is so important, why wouldn't we require ID? If some people don't have ID, we should make sure everyone gets one. In what ways have voter ID laws been abused in the past? If voter ID laws were approached in good faith, would they still likely be used to discriminate against minorities?
So this is actually the question for voter ID laws. There was a commission a while back, a bipartisan commission that actually recommended voter ID as just sort of a standard good governance issue, right? And also recommended that it was pretty prescient, though, in noting that if identification was not something that was free and accessible to everybody, that voter ID could become a burden. And so that's the basic calculus right there, is that for some reason, we require people to have ID for lots of different things in lots of different states in America. And we require them to spend money and time to get those IDs. And we create a burden on proving who they are and their citizenship, a really actually extensive burden of documentation for those folks that is out of reach for lots of people. For example, one of the examples I like to give when people are saying, voter ID is just so, it makes sense because IDs are so easy to get. It was easy for me to get mine. I'm not gonna lie. I just, when I was 16, I got my driver's license and I had to know what a stop sign and a yield sign were. And that was about it. I think I had to show a birth certificate and I had it. For my grandmother, who lived in the same house as me, when our house was flooded, she lost her official documents, right, that she had. And okay, you say you lose your copies, you go back to your home state and you just ask for them, right? It turns out it's not so easy for people, for Black folks, especially born during Jim Crow America, because hospitals did not actually, weren't all that diligent in maintaining and keeping your records. For some people, the birth certificate they took home with from the hospital when they were born is the only document on file. You won't go back, if you go back to your county government, they won't have one on file for you. So it just creates actually, especially for people who are poor, who are elderly, who don't have the means to drive around from office to office, our current burden for getting an ID in lots of cases is the problem. And if we said in good faith, okay, we want to solve this problem, we want to spend, however much money it takes to help everybody find their official documentation, to get them copies of their birth certificates, to have a database, a national database on file for everybody, and to get them IDs. Okay, then we're having one conversation. But if we're talking about voter IDs in the current context, which is, people still are having real difficulties getting just a permit or a license, the talk about security seems a little bit disingenuous. And the fact remains that actually IDs are not all that useful for creating voter security in the first place. They wouldn't really stop a whole lot of forms of voter fraud. The only thing they would stop is if somebody, for some reason, decided to say that they were Vann Newkirk and decided to come to the polling place and vote. And I mean, that might happen. I can't rule it out, but it's just not the way that voter fraud has gone in the country. So we're talking about a rather onerous solution for lots of people for a problem that doesn't actually exist.
Thank you for answering that. Okay, so we're just about to hit, according to my computer, we've hit 1 o'clock. There is one more question, if you don't mind sticking around, and then we will finish up with maybe some off-the-record thank yous that we've got through chat as well. This last question was someone asking your opinion on the act you referred to already, HR1, how that might address some of the issues you talked about today.
Yeah, so HR1, we'll see how or if it passes Congress. But it is, quite frankly, one of the most bold pieces of voting rights legislation in really generations. What it would do, it would create automatic national voter registration for everybody when they are of age. Would create a process for that. So it would cut out a lot of the ways that people are disenfranchised now, which is lots of states just make it incredibly difficult to register and don't have automatic registration. And it actually would cut out lots of the things that I talked about voter ID, which is it would help people with the sort of burden of documentation and proving who they were. But it would also expand, it would create mandatory provisions for early voting, for absentee voting without cause, and would try to do a couple things with limiting the reach and expansion of money in politics. Those are the main prongs. And the last prong for me is it would end the disenfranchisement of people with felony records. Those are things that would immediately get likely millions of people onto voting rolls and would dramatically change the shape of elections in America. It's something I really think that would be a change unlike anything we've had since the VRA if it's passed. It's a big deal.
All right, thank you. And I think we're going to we'll end there. We just want to end with a big thank you for coming and spending your time with us and interacting with us here. We really appreciate it and appreciate all the work you do